The station smelled like copper and something Mara couldn't name, a sweetness that sat at the back of her throat and didn't leave. She stood in the intake corridor of the Veth Collective's Interspecies Academic Center, one duffel bag over her shoulder, wearing clothes that were already wrong for the humidity. She was 17. She was from Barrow, Alaska, and she was, according to the 40-page orientation document she'd read twice on the transport shuttle, the third human ever admitted to this school. The first two had left within a semester. The document didn't say why. Mara shifted her bag and looked around at the other students filtering through intake. There were Veth, the dominant species here, bipedal but narrow through the chest, with 4 optical clusters instead of 2 eyes, their skin a shifting pale gray that darkened at the edges when they were under stress. She'd read about the stress darkening. She filed it away. There were Devari, low and wide, moving in groups of 3 the way they always did. Their communication a series of pressure changes in the air around them that registered as a faint pulse against Mara's eardrums. She could feel them talking without hearing a word. There were 2 Ossel, tall and entirely still in the way of things that were very old, their translated voices coming through small devices clipped to their collar structures. And there was a Veth student standing near the wall, watching her with all 4 optical clusters and not pretending otherwise. Mara met all 4 of them. The student's skin went immediately dark at the edges. She didn't look away. She'd learned, reading about Veth culture, that looking away first was a statement of inferiority you couldn't take back. It wasn't aggression to hold eye contact. It was just refusal to rank yourself below someone who hadn't earned that. The student finally turned toward the wall and began examining something on it that was almost certainly not interesting. Mara walked to the intake desk. The administrator there was Veth, older, with small scars at the edges of 2 optical clusters that spoke of something Mara didn't know yet. She decided to learn what scars meant here before she assumed anything. Mara Voss, the administrator said, reading from a tablet. Human, Earth designation, North American continent, subarctic region. A pause. That is unusual. Barrows on the Arctic Ocean. Mara said. Northern Alaska, about 4,000 people. We get 4 months of no sunlight and 4 months of no dark. And you chose to apply here. I wanted to study xenobiology. Your program is the best one accessible to non-collective species. The administrator set down the tablet. The last 2 humans left, Mara said. I know. Can I have my room assignment? A pause that felt less like processing and more like reassessment. Then the administrator handed her a key card. Room 14 OHV, she said. Adjusted atmospheric pressure. Increased humidity removed. Lighting spectrum shifted. It took some doing. Thank you, Mara said, and meant it. Her room was small and smelled like filtered air and the ghost of whoever had calibrated it. A single window looked out over the station's interior habitat, a cylinder of engineered green and careful light. Mara set her bag on the bed, sat down, and looked out at the green for a long time. She wasn't afraid. That wasn't quite true. She was afraid, but it was a quiet kind, the kind that lived in the body without announcing itself, the kind she'd grown up with, in a place where the cold was a metaphor but fact, where you paid attention to land because the land didn't care about you, and that was the beginning of wisdom. She had come here to learn. She had not come here to leave. Classes at the Veth Academic Center operated on a structure Mara found both familiar and disorienting. Familiar, because there were lectures and assignments and particular social geometry of young people in proximity to each other, all of them trying to figure out who they were in relation to everyone else. Disorienting, because the geometry here ran on different rules. Veth's social hierarchy operated on what the orientation document called recognition chains, essentially a continuous renegotiation of status through accumulated interactions. Every conversation was a small data point. Who spoke first, who conceded a point, who maintained optical contact, who stepped aside in a corridor. The chain wasn't fixed. It was constantly being revised. Every student knew, approximately, where they stood in relation to every other student, and that standing shaped everything from seating in lecture halls to resource access in labs. For Mara, as a species entirely outside the recognition chain system. The default position was 0, not low 0, unmapped. She didn't register in the calculation because no one had any data points on humans. This, she realized by her third day, was both her greatest vulnerability and the most interesting thing about her situation. On the fourth day, she met Ivan. He was Veth, which meant 4 optical clusters and skin that shifted gray. But he was also something else. There was a slowness to his movements that read as deliberate rather than uncertain, and his cluster arrangement was slightly asymmetrical in a way that was probably congenital and had probably shaped his entire life at this school. He was, she realized, also outside the chain in some functional way. Not 0. He'd been here 2 years, but low enough that he sat alone at the edge of the common area. She sat across from him because the table had an outlet and her tablet needed charging. "I am not in a conversational state," he said, through his translation device. His actual voice underneath, it was a resonant hum that she felt more than heard. "Neither am I," she said. "I just need to charge this." He watched her plug in the tablet. Humans need external power for their technology. Most of us aren't internally bioluminescent, yeah. A pause. That was contextually humorous. "A little bit," she agreed. She read her xenobiology assignment. He went back to whatever he was doing. After 40 minutes, when her tablet was charged, she picked it up. "My name is Mara." "Ivan," he said. She nodded and left. The next day, she sat there again. And the day after, by the end of the second week, they were talking, not about important things at first. She told him about ice fishing, which he found conceptually alarming. He told her about Veth memory structures, that adult Veth could selectively deactivate certain memory clusters, not delete them but render them inaccessible, which they did with painful experiences, that the capacity developed around age equivalent to 15 and was considered a milestone of maturity. "Can you access them again?" she asked. "Yes, but you have to choose to. And once you do, the memory is no longer softenable. It becomes permanent texture." "We don't have that," Mara said after a moment. "Once we know something, we can't unknow it. We can reinterpret it, but we're stuck with the weight." Ivan was quiet. "That sounds extremely difficult." "We think it makes us something," she said. "I'm still deciding what." It happened in the lab corridor, between the second period xenobiology seminar and the midday resource period. Mara had been reaching for a specimen case on the upper shelf, one she had signed out, her name on the log, her assignment waiting, when a student named Ress stepped in front of her and took it. Ress was Veth, high chain, the kind of person whose recognition number she'd heard other students reference the way you reference gravity. His skin was an even pale gray with no stress darkening anywhere. He took the specimen case, looked at her, and walked away. Mara stood there with her hand still extended. Around her, 2 other Veth students watched and said nothing. One Davari trio shifted their collective pressure in a way she interpreted as discomfort. She understood what had happened. She was 0 on the chain. He had demonstrated it, publicly, in front of witnesses. She had no recognized standing to dispute a resource claim. In the Veth framework, this wasn't theft. It was a statement of hierarchy so fundamental it barely needed acknowledgement. She picked up a different specimen case, one that would work for her assignment but would cost her an extra hour of sample prep, and went back to her bench. She didn't let her face do anything. But inside, something she recognized from a long time ago, something she developed in a place where weather could kill you and the correct response to threat was not panic but inventory. Something began taking notes. She told Ivan that evening. He was quiet for a long time. His skin went to a medium gray at the edges, which she'd learned meant something between sadness and the kind of anger that had nowhere to go. "Ress is 3rd chain in our cohort," he said. "You have no counterweight." "I know." Reporting it to administration would be, "The orientation document says there is a process." The orientation document was written by someone who thought 2 semesters was a good outcome for a human student. Mara said, "I'm not going to the administration." "Then what will you do?" She looked out the window at the habitat cylinder. "Learn," she said. "The same thing I came here to do. Here is what the Veth recognition chain system didn't account for. A person who wasn't trying to climb it." Mara had grown up in a place where status was a secondary concern to survival, and survival meant observation. You watched the ice for the darkness of thin places. You watched the sky for the particular gray that meant the wind was about to shift. You watched the animals, the way a seal surfaced, the way a raven behaved near a carcass, because everything that lived in that environment was telling you something about it. She brought this to the academic center. She began mapping, not the chain, the system around the chain, the way resources moved, which labs were overstocked and which were contested, which faculty members had influence outside their nominal roles, which students were high chain in current standing, but had inflection points coming, the third years approaching their thesis reviews, the ones whose standing was tied to projects that were beginning to stumble. She also began learning the parts of the translation device that her orientation document hadn't covered. The devices were distributed to non-VEST students and simplified the translation, but simplified was another word for lossy. She'd noticed in conversations with Ivan that the device rendered VETH emotional registers flatly. The stress darkening was visual, but there were vocal components, harmonics and hum, that the device leveled out. She started recording lectures, running the recordings through the raw audio, learning the harmonics the way she'd once learned to read ice. Nobody noticed her doing this because nobody was looking at her. She was zero. Invisible was its own kind of resource. The second incident happened 6 weeks in. She was working late in the lab. She had signing rights to the space after 18th hour, a time most VEST students avoided because the light spectrum shifted in a way they found uncomfortable. When Rest came in with 2 others, they didn't take anything this time. Rest stood in front of her bench and spoke in VETH, not through translation, which meant he intended her to understand the limitation, not the words. She understood more than he intended. The harmonic said, amusement, contempt, certainty that the target is no recourse. She understood enough vocabulary to catch. Wrong spectrum creature, zero chain, does not know she should have left. She looked up from her work. She addressed him in VETH. Her accent was wrong, her case endings imperfect. But the harmonics, she'd been practicing the harmonics. She said, I know your thesis review is in 11 weeks. I know your primary dataset has a calibration error in the 3rd sample tier. I have not mentioned this to anyone. The room went very still. Ressa's skin went completely dark at the edges. All 4 optical clusters fixed on her. She held contact with all 4. She said in VETH with careful harmonics, I am mentioning it to you now as a data point. She went back to her work. After a moment, she heard them leave. She didn't tell Ivan what she'd done for a week. When she did, he was quiet for so long she thought she'd misread him. Then he said, How did you learn the calibration error? His lab is adjacent to mine on the scheduling grid. I can see which samples he's pulling. The 3rd-tier samples in xenobiological studies of Kurov-class environments have a known atmospheric interference that most VETH researchers account for with a correction factor. He wasn't using the correction factor. I could see it in the sample documentation when he left it visible. That is, Ivan stopped. How did you know to look? I didn't. I look at everything. Another long pause. Mara, you should understand something. He was using the device, but also the harmonics underneath, which he was now able to read fairly well, and both were saying the same thing, which meant he was serious. What you did is called verith in our language. The translation approximates to leverage disclosure or structural pressure. It is a recognized social instrument. Okay, it is a recognized social instrument that requires chain standing to use without consequence. If Rest decides you acted without standing, he can refer the interaction to a recognition council, and they will judge it as a violation. Mara set down her tablet. What's the consequence? Removal from the academic program. VETH academic centers do not tolerate social instrument violations by zero-chain participants. She sat with that. Why are you telling me this? She asked. Because he hasn't referred it, Ivan said, and I want you to understand why. She waited, because if he refers it, he has to disclose the interaction, which means disclosing that you knew about the calibration error, which means the calibration error becomes part of his official academic record. Ivan's skin was a complicated gray. You didn't threaten him. You gave him a choice. That is not how zero-chain participants behave. It is not how participants with any chain standing behave. Actually, it is how architects behave. Architects. There's a word in OVEF, pre-chain, for people who understood that systems were something you could redesign. He looked at her with all 4 optical clusters, and this time it didn't feel like assessment. It felt like he was trying to tell her something he hadn't figured out how to say yet. We haven't had a word for that in about 200 years. She should have known that stillness wasn't resolution. Rest didn't refer to the interaction. But rest had allies, and those allies had made their own assessment of the situation, which was that a zero-chain creature had used Verith against a third-chain student and faced no consequence, and that this was a precedent that could not be allowed to stand, because precedents were how change changed. They came for her through the administration, not overtly. The Veth Academic Center had a resource allocation review process that ran every 10 weeks. Resource access, lab time, specimen materials, simulation hours, was formally assessed against academic standing. Academic standing included chain-weighted components, which were technically optional to report, but functionally universal. With Ivan's help, she'd understood this for weeks. What she hadn't anticipated was the speed. The review was moved up. Her access was flagged for reassessment. She received a formal notification at 23rd hour that her lab signing rights were under review pending a standing assessment, and that the assessment would require documentation of her academic contributions as evaluated by her cohort peers. Her cohort peers were Veth. She was zero-chain. The documentation process would be conducted in front of a recognition council, which meant harmonics, which meant she'd be assessed not just on what she said, but on the emotional weight she carried when she said it. She sat in her room with the notification on her tablet and the habitat cylinder outside her window and thought for a long time. Then she called Ivan. "I see it," he said before she spoke. "I heard about the review moving." "How?" "I still have sources in the chain, even from low standing." A pause. "Mara, the documentation process. Do you understand what they're planning?" "They're planning for me to fail the standing assessment and lose my lab access. Without lab access, I can't complete my thesis credits. Without thesis credits, I can't finish the program." "Yes." "And they've structured it so that it looks like a legitimate process." "Yes." She was quiet. "The 2 humans before me," she said. "Was it this?" Ivan took a long time to answer. "I was first year when the second one was here. I remember. He was very technically skilled. But he didn't. He tried to engage the chain directly, to earn standing by performance. They moved his review processes until he had nothing left. Mara closed her eyes. "Ivan," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to understand that I'm asking it because I trust you, not because I'm trying to use you. Ask. What do you want? From this school? From your program?" "You've never said." A long silence. The kind that meant the question had reached somewhere the device didn't usually translate. "I want to finish my thesis," he said finally. "I want to publish. There's research on the Karaf class atmospheric data that no one is doing correctly because everyone is too interested in the chain to spend time at the margins." His harmonics were complex underneath the words. She heard grief there and something older than grief. "I have been at the margins for 2 years. Then we do this together," she said. "Not for me, for both of us." She had 4 days. She spent the first day reviewing every public record of recognition council assessments she could access, which was not many but was more than 0. She was looking for precedent, cases where the outcome had been unexpected, cases where the system had registered something it wasn't designed to register. She found one from 60 years ago. A Duvari student at a different Veth institution had appeared before a recognition council, and instead of presenting individual standing documentation, had presented collective standing, the assessment of their entire 3 unit, which under ancient Veth law was a valid form of recognition for non-Veth species, a provision that had been written into early interspecies agreements and never formally repealed, just forgotten. She spent the second day with Ivan, reconstructing the legal basis. His access to institutional archives was slightly better than hers, and they worked until 3rd hour, past when they were both coherent. Fueled by whatever approximated coffee in the station's food system, she spent the 3rd day doing something no one expected her to do. She went to the Duvari. The 3 units she approached was one she'd observed in her mapping. They were 4th years, their collective standing was high, and she had noticed, over months, that they had a complicated relationship with the chain system. Devari didn't experience chain hierarchies internally. Their collective structure was fundamentally cooperative, and she had watched them navigate the Veth system with what she now recognized as exhaustive pragmatism. She found them in the common area at morning period and sat across from them. She felt the pressure shift of their communication, discussing her arrival. She couldn't understand it, but she felt the texture of it. Curious, cautious. She put a document on the table, the 60-year-old legal provision. She said, slowly, because she wanted the translation device to catch every word correctly. I am appearing before a recognition council in 2 days. I am going to argue that my standing should be assessed under interspecies collective provisions. I would ask whether your collective would be willing to offer a standing witness. The pressure around her changed. She waited. One of them, the one she'd mentally cataloged as their primary external communicator, based on observation, said, through their own device, why would we do this? Because the provision also applies to you, she said. It's been dormant for 60 years. If it's reactivated by a successful council ruling, it changes how Devari academic standing is assessed at this institution. Permanently. The pressure changed again. Longer this time. You have read our history, the communicator said. I've been reading everything I could get access to since I arrived, she said. I look at everything. A long pause. We will be there, they said. The 4th day, she prepared her harmonics. She practiced in her room, alone, using the recordings she'd made over 4 months. Her voice couldn't produce the full range of Veth emotional resonance. Her physiology was simply different, but she had learned where the gaps were, and she had found, through careful work, that she could compensate, not by imitation, by translation, by finding the analogous registers in her own voice, the places where human vocal production naturally carried something that mapped onto the Veth harmonic system if you understood the underlying structure. She couldn't speak Veth perfectly, but she could speak honestly, in a way the harmonics would register as honest. That, she had decided, was enough. The Recognition Council was 5 senior faculty, 3 of them Veth and 2 of them Ossel. They sat in a formal assessment chamber that Mara had not been in before. Curved walls, lighting at the precise Veth comfortable spectrum. Seats arranged in a pattern she recognized from her reading as the Varithi configuration, meaning the person being assessed stood at the center. She stood at the center. Ress was in the observation tier, with several of his cohort. His skin was a controlled pale gray. Ivan was also in the observation tier. His skin was medium gray at the edges, which meant a complicated feeling she now knew how to read. Afraid, and staying anyway. The 3 Devari were standing to the left of the council formation, which was irregular, and had already caused a brief administrative discussion she'd been unable to hear. The lead council member, an older Veth woman whose optical scars Mara had finally learned the meaning of, they meant she'd survived a Varithi preceding herself decades ago, and that was a whole other story she filed away, spoke the opening of the assessment. She addressed Mara. You have requested that the standing assessment be conducted under interspecies collective provisions. The Council has reviewed the legal basis you submitted. The provision is valid and has not been repealed. A pause, and her harmonics carried something Mara read as surprised but engaged. You are the first student in this institution's history to invoke it. I know, Mara said. In Veth, she heard the shift in the chamber, saw Ressa's skin go to medium gray, fast. She continued in Veth, not perfectly but honestly, her words and harmonics both. I was told when I arrived that my species had no position in the recognition chain, that I was 0. I want to say clearly that this is accurate. I have not climbed the chain. I have not attempted to. I am not here to argue that I have Veth standing. She paused. Let the harmonics settle. I am here to argue that standing is not the only form of weight. She looked at the council, making optical contact with each member in turn, not as a challenge, just as acknowledgement. In 4 months, I have mapped the resource flow of this institution. I have learned your language well enough to understand what is said when the translation is turned off. I have identified a calibration error in ongoing Karov-class research that will compromise published findings if uncorrected. I have built one genuine relationship with a student who has been at the margins of this institution for 2 years and is doing work that no one else is doing correctly. She let a breath out. I have done all of this as a zero-chain participant, not because I wanted to subvert your system, because where I come from, you learn the environment you're in and you survive it, and surviving it is not the same as conquering it. She turned slightly to acknowledge the Devari. These 3 students have offered to serve as witnesses to collective standing under provision I cited. Their academic record in this institution is exceptional. Their standing in their own species framework is the equivalent of what you might call high chain. They are willing to extend that recognition to me, not because we are friends, but because they have watched me for 4 months and they have decided, in their own collective assessment process, that I belong here. She turned back to the council. I am not asking you to pretend I have vest standing. I am asking you to recognize that your institution contains more than one kind of weight, and that your founding interspecies agreement said so. I am asking you to let me stay and finish my work. She stopped speaking. The chamber was very quiet. The lead council member looked at her for a long time. Then she looked at the Devari. Then she began a low-register conversation with the other council members that was too complex for Mara to fully follow, but whose texture she read as not hostile, engaged, genuinely uncertain in a way that people were uncertain when something had moved the furniture of their thinking. Then something happened that she had not planned for. Rest stood up in the observation tier. Everyone looked at him. He spoke in Veth, and Mara understood it. And the harmonics were the most complicated she had ever heard from him, because what they carried was not contempt or certainty, but something she had no framework for until she recognized it, slowly, as the sound of a person reevaluating something they thought was fixed. He said, "The calibration error she identified is real. I have confirmed it. I did not report it because I did not want a discussion of how it was identified." He paused. She told me, directly, in private. She did not use it against me. She gave me information that would have improved my research, without asking for anything. He looked at Mara. "That is not zero-chain behavior," he said. "I do not have a category for it, but I do not think it is zero." He sat down. The lead council member looked at Mara again. "This assessment will be recessed for deliberation," she said, and the harmonics underneath said, "Clearly, this is not how assessors usually feel." They gave her a ruling 4 days later. The collective provisions were reinstated, not just for her, but as active institutional policy, which meant the Devari 3 unit standing would be formally reassessed under a framework that recognized their collective structure. It also meant that future non-vest students could invoke the provision, and the institution would be required to evaluate it. Her lab access was restored. The Recognition Council's lead member, her name was severed, and the scars at her optical clusters meant she had stood before a council at age 20 and argued for a curricular change that had been considered structurally inappropriate. And she had won, and the winning had cost her something, and she had kept the scars as permanent texture on purpose. Sent Mara a message that contained only a single Veth phrase. The translation device rendered it as correctly weighted. She looked it up in the original and found that the literal translation was closer to "You understood what the ground was before you stepped on it." She saved the message. Ivan published his Kurov-class atmospheric research 8 months later. The calibration correction Mara had identified was credited in the methodology section. The paper was read by 17 institutions. Mara stayed for 3 years. She finished her xenobiology thesis on adaptive observation in multi-species academic environments, which was technically science and also, as Ivan told her once, a very long document about how she had survived the first semester. She went home to Barrow once, in the 2nd year, for 30 days. She walked out onto the ice in January in the dark, and stood there for a long time feeling the cold and listening to the way it moved. She thought about systems, about the ice that looked uniform and wasn't, about the Veth recognition chain, which looked rigid and wasn't, about Rest standing up in a council chamber and saying something that cost him exactly the kind of pride he'd built his standing on, and doing it anyway. She thought about Ivan, alone at the edge of the common area for 2 years, waiting for someone to sit across from him, not because of what he could offer Chain, but because the outlet was there and her tablet needed charging. She thought about the Davari, carrying 60 years of dormant legal rights in an institution that had simply stopped looking. She thought about the first human and the second human, and what they had run into, and what she hoped she could know, she would never know, had perhaps been slightly different for them. Even a little, even in ways nobody noticed. She thought about her grandmother, who had told her once that the ice teaches you one thing before it teaches you anything else. You are not the most important thing out here, and that is the beginning, not the end. The cold moved. She went inside. She had work to do.